Thank you, Trevor. Okay, Genesis 19 is marked by several inversions of expected social behavior. Guests are threatened with rape rather than welcomed, as is prescribed in Leviticus 19:33. Daughters are offered up to a mob rather than protected from prostitution, as Leviticus 19:29 commands. Guests are protect their hosts rather than vice versa, and daughters rape their father rather than honoring him, as in Exodus 20:12, or covering him when he's drunk, as in Genesis 9:23. This paper interprets Genesis 19 with the Bakhtinian concept of carnival by reading the events described as a carnivalesque and grotesque comedy. Reading Genesis 19 as a comedy allows us to take seriously both the threat of rape, which begins the chapter, and the actual rape, which marks its conclusion. Rather than reading the narrator's detached narration and lack of overt condemnation of both Lot's and his daughter's actions as an endorsement, reading the story as a comedy allows us to read with the text and see their actions as horrific acts in an inverted world. Once we see Genesis 19 as a literary carnival, it becomes clear that Lot is the carnival king, crowned at the beginning of the chapter by his sudden appearance as a principal character and decrowned at the end by his daughters. Viewing Lot as a comic figure and a carnival king, we can see more clearly the ways in which he's marked as an outsider from both the Sodomite and Israelite perspective. He's an outsider among his neighbors in Sodom, as the men at the door make clear. And though he is Abraham's nephew, he's outside the main family line on which this epic is focused, and is distanced from Abraham both narratively and geographically. This outsider status is further emphasized at the end of the chapter through his connection to the Moabites and the Ammonites, both enemies of the Israelites. Most importantly, reading Lot as a carnival king places his sexual abuse at the climax of the story, forcing us to confront it as an end in itself rather than a means to an end. That is, the propagation of the Moabites and the Ammonites. In this paper, I propose a reading of Genesis 19, which takes the entire chapter as a narrative unit. This is supported by the inclusio that's formed by the threat of sexual assault at the beginning of the chapter and the actualized sexual assault at its conclusion, and also by what I'll argue is the crowning and subsequent decrowning of the carnival king Lot. Bakhtin describes four main carnivalistic categories in his Problems of Dostoevsky's Poetics. The first is that carnival is a pageant without footlights. It makes no distinction between participant and spectator. Thus, carnival is not a performance, but something lived. And carnival is in some ways life turned inside out, or the reverse side of the world. Second, hierarchical structures are suspended, giving rise to free and familiar contact among people. This new mode of interrelationship between individuals also facilitates the organization of mass actions. Third, this is often embodied through the juxtaposition of opposites, which Bakhtin terms carnivalistic mésalliance. Part of this category is the theme of dualism, and thus paired images, whether chosen for their contrast or similarity, are common features of carnival. And fourth, flowing from the previous two categories is the profanation of the sacred and the elevation of the profane. These carnivalistic categories are embodied in what Bakhtin calls carnivalistic acts, the primary example of which is the crowning and subsequent decrowning of the carnival king. At the core of this act is a deep sense of ambivalence, because even the act of crowning contains within it the promise of decrowning. This ambivalence permeates the carnival. Throughout, and especially in the crowning and decrowning, is the pathos of shifts and changes, of death and renewal. As Bakhtin puts it, birth is fraught with death, and death with new birth. The pathos of death and renewal and the ambivalence which characterizes carnival are what make it uniquely appropriate as a lens for the interpretation of Genesis 19. The character of Lot has troubled many scholars. He's saved from the destruction of Sodom, which implies that he's one of the righteous that Abraham refers to in 18:23. But his actions, primarily his disregard for the safety and dignity of his daughters, tell a different story. Consequently, there's disagreement on whether to characterize Lot as a righteous man, a bumbling fool, or a lecherous drunk. A Carnivalesque reading embraces this ambivalence, as Carnival and seriocomic literature which it informs often combines opposing characteristics in the same character, such as the wise fool or the tragic clown. As we've already established, Genesis 19 contains several inversions of expected social behavior. Hospitality is inverted both because of the reaction of the men of Sodom to Lot's guests and the fact that Lot's guests are the ones who protect him. Paternal protection is inverted in Lot's offer to the mob to do what is right in your eyes to his virgin daughters. And finally, at the climax of the story, when the same daughters take advantage of an intoxicated Lot. Stuart Lassine's interpretation of the cannibal mothers in 2 Kings 6:24 through 33 and the Levite and his hosts in Judges 19 is particularly useful here. Lassine notices the myopic focus each character has on one object, which contributes to their inability to see the absurdity or horror of their own actions, and argues that these characteristics are what make them comic, but also show them to be characters living in an inverted world. This characteristic, which Bergson describes as inelasticity, absent-mindedness, or rigidity, is typical of comic characters and also highlights their likeness to a thing. Citing Bergson, Lassine argues that it is precisely the comic element of the cannibal mothers and the Levite and his hosts' behavior which highlights the inhumanity of their actions, and which our laughter attempts to correct. Where I differ from Lassine is in his claim that the Levite and his host are contrasted with Lot. I would argue that this rigidity is shared by Lot in his singular focus on protecting his guests, which leads him to offer up his own daughters to a hostile mob, and his daughters, whose focus on continuing the family line leads them to sexually assault their own father. The actions of Lot's daughters, in addition to being an inversion of expected filial piety, is an inversion of the callous way in which Lot treated their bodies and sexual agency. Just like the cannibal mothers and the Levite and his host, their comic myopia highlights the inhumanity of their actions and the inverted world in which they're operating. By offering up his daughters to the mob, Lot, because of his singular focus on his duty of hospitality, is also misinterpreting the intent of the mob. The men of Sodom are not driven by lust, but by hostility towards the foreign men who have come into their city. Thus, not only is Lot's offer a shocking and extreme response to the situation, it's an inappropriate and incongruous response to the mob's request. This is made clear by their response. And I quote, But they replied, "Stand back." And they said, "This fellow came here as an alien and he would play the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." Not only do they reject Lot's offer without a thought, they also emphasize the real reason they've surrounded Lot's house, their hostility towards outsiders, through their reiteration of Lot's foreignness. Moving on to the suspension of hierarchy. This is most clearly displayed in the actions of Lot's daughters at the end of the chapter. While fathers are meant to control and protect their daughter's sexuality, by the end of the story, not only does Lot lose control over his daughter's sexual agency, his daughters take control of his. In the concluding verses of the chapter, Lot's daughters, as Bruce Fodder puts it mildly, treat in a singularly unfilial manner a father who had not exactly manifested to them the paternal ideal. Here, Vodder is highlighting the breakdown of a parent-child hierarchy, but the gender hierarchy is also broken down through their actions. Throughout the Hebrew Bible, with a few notable exceptions, women don't seem to have much sexual agency, let alone the desire or power to initiate sexual relations. And yet, more than simply initiating sex, these women dominate a man sexually, allowing him no sexual agency. The way in which this inversion of normative gender hierarchy emasculates Lot is obvious. But the sisters' claim that there is not a man on earth to come into us also suddenly hints at that Lot is already not a man. We also see a disregard for hierarchy in the mob's reaction to Lot's visitors. Not only are they disregarding the custom of guest right, they're threatening to assault and abuse angelic messengers. Further, as Bakhtin argues, the breakdown of social boundaries and hierarchies also facilitates the organization of mass group actions. The hyperbolic exaggeration with which the mob is described, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, reflects this aspect of carnival. The insistence that all the men participated in the mob also reflects the pervasiveness of carnival. No man is outside the performance of carnival. Each is both a spectator and a performer. That is, it seems, with the exception of Lot, who is the only man conspicuously not included in the mob. At the beginning of the chapter, it seems like Lot is juxtaposed with the men of Sodom and seems to be resisting the carnival of Sodom. He offers to host the messengers that come into the city, and like Abraham in the previous chapter, he addresses them with deference and offers them shelter and feeds them. Most importantly, when the men of Sodom come to his door, he attempts to maintain etiquette and decorum by protecting his guests, in contrast to the men of Sodom who threaten to violate the guest right. However, Lot's response to the mob, as we discussed above, betrays his rigid focus on one object and changes our assessment of Lot. It's made clear that even he is part of the carnival. Even before this crucial moment, though Lot is compared favorably with Abraham in some ways, the two are also contrasted. As Lederer captures in the title of his book on the subject, Day in Mamre, Night in Sodom, the most striking contrast is the setting of the two episodes. While Abraham is visited in the day, sitting in front of his tent in Mamre, Lot is visited at night, sitting at the gates of the city of Sodom. Both the timing and the location of the episodes are different. Genesis 18 takes place in the daylight in the open, while Genesis 19 takes place in the evening in the midst of a city, as shadows are lengthening and masking those lurking in the alleys. Abraham is also juxtaposed with Lot's wife, as Lot's family is fleeing Sodom. Directly after Lot's wife is turned into a pillar of salt for looking back at Sodom, the narration skips forward to the next morning, showing Abraham looking down at Sodom, surveying the damage. And I quote, "Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord," in the episode that Richard spoke so eloquently about in his paper. And he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the plain and saw the smoke of the land going up like the smoke of a furnace. The juxtaposition of Lot's wife's gaze and Abraham's gaze is tragically comic. While Lot's wife is immediately turned into a pillar of salt for looking back, Abraham is able to look down on the destruction without consequence, just as the roadrunner is able to run through a tunnel painted on the cliff, while Wile E. Coyote is flattened as he attempts the same thing. There's no obvious reason why one should be punished for the same action when the other isn't. Further, by directly referencing Abraham's conversation with God in Genesis 18, 23 through 33, and then showing the physical distance between Abraham and Lot, these two verses serve to remind us of Abraham's personal connection with God and also distances Abraham from Lot. And yet, Lot's connection with Abraham is not completely severed. In the next verse, the narrator gives us an interpretation of what has happened so far. "So it was that when God destroyed the cities of the plain, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had settled." While this verse isn't particularly flattering for Lot, as it emphasizes his lack of agency in his salvation, it also emphasizes his connection to Abraham. Even more complex than a juxtaposition of two characters is the juxtaposition of two aspects in one character, as we see with Lot. Lawrence Turner argues for this complexity in Lot's character in his article, Lot as Jekyll and Hyde. As we discussed earlier, Lot is introduced at the beginning of the chapter as a potential exception to the blanket characteristic of the people of Sodom as wicked. However, his reactions to the mob at the door is clearly wicked. Lot, it seems, is a contradiction. He's both righteous and wicked. However, this contrast serves a larger point. As Turner argues, Lot's character shows us that the moral world of Genesis is more complicated than Abraham assumes. When in chapter 18, Abraham asks God, "Will you indeed weigh the righteous with the wicked?" Even the characterization of Lot embraces the ambivalence of Carnival. Related to the juxtaposition of opposites is the pairing of two like things, a technique repeated over and over again in Genesis 19. In fact, the chapter opens with the phrase, Vayavo shnei hamalachim sadama ba'erev, and came two of the messengers to Sodom in the evening, making two the second word in the chapter. This is significant because these messengers are ostensibly the same messengers that visited Abraham in the previous chapter, and yet Abraham is visited by three men. Two messengers come to the city. Lot has two daughters and two sons-in-law. In Genesis 19, the sacred and the profane are brought together under one roof when Lot offers to host the messengers / angels that come to investigate Sodom. It's true that the same messengers from God came to visit Abraham in the previous chapter, but the contrast between the sacred quality of the messengers and the profane nature of Lot is emphasized by the naming of these visitors as messengers, hamalachim, in Genesis 19, rather than simply men, anashim, as they are in Genesis 18. This profanation is taken even further when the mob threatens to rape these angelic guests. More importantly, however, the carnival is not taken too far, as the messengers are able to prevent the carnival from leaving the square and invading the home. Further, Sodom itself is defined by its profanation of the sacred. In Genesis 18:20, God speaks of their grave sin. Lot cautions the men to not act so wickedly, and the outcry against Sodom is mentioned multiple times. It's unclear what the precise nature of their sin is, but it is clear that it has violated sacred codes, as it's displeasing to both God and his messengers. As we discussed above, the central element of Carnival is the mock crowning and subsequent decrowning of the Carnival King. In Genesis 19, which we've already seen to display many aspects of Carnival, Lot is characterized as the Carnival King, and his decrowning comes at the end of the chapter as his authority and manhood are stripped from him in an act of sexual abuse by his own daughters. Lot, as Carnival King, is shown narratively through his sudden ascension from minor character to principal character in Genesis 19. Up until chapter 19, not only is Lot a relatively minor character in the Abraham cycle, he's progressively distanced from Abraham and moved to the peripherals of the narrative. He's introduced in chapter 11 as part of the descendants of Shem and is mentioned along Abram as being part of the group Terah brought with him out of Ur. But 2 chapters later, Lot is separated from Abram when he chooses to settle in Sodom, while Abram pitches his tent in Mamre. Larry R. Haler argues that Lot is introduced as a potential heir for Abram in chapter 11, and that the geographical separation of the two in chapter 13 is significant in that it eliminates this possibility. And yet, at the start of Genesis 19, Lot is introduced as the main character of the story. Since Lot has already been eliminated as a potential heir, this sudden focus on Lot seems out of place, unless we read the story as a literary carnival. By reading Genesis 19 as Carnival, we can understand Lot's sudden appearance as the principal character as his crowning. Throughout the chapter, then, Lot plays the lead by mimicking Abraham's actions in the previous chapter. And in a longer paper, I would go into more of the ways in which Lot mimics Abraham, but we don't have time to go into all of that right here. The sexual abuse of Lot by his daughters can be seen not only as his decrowning, but because it's the last we hear of Lot, it can also be read as his symbolic execution. He's stripped of his name and agency as soon as the sisters formulate their plot. After verse 30, Lot is no longer mentioned by name, nor is he the subject of any verbs. The decrowning of the Carnival King is often accompanied by verbal and physical abuse, and thus, while his delaying and indecisiveness until now were subtle jabs at his character, his final decrowning and mock execution occur through this act of sexual violence. With this decrowning is made all the more humiliating by the fact that the act was perpetrated by women. However, Bakhtin argues all the symbolic aspects of this ceremonial of decrowning acquire a second and positive level of meaning. It is not naked absolute negation and destruction. Absolute negation, like absolute affirmation, is unknown to Carnival. This is perfectly embodied in the birth of Lot's two sons as the result of his symbolic decrowning. The end of Genesis 19 is so ambivalent, it borders on paradoxical. At the macro level, the chapter begins with destruction and ends with birth. And at the micro level, Lot is emasculated by his status as a victim of sexual abuse, but at the same time, his manhood is reinforced by his fathering of two sons. The ambivalence of Carnival, the blending of death and renewal, the combination of praise and ridicule is the perfect vehicle for the origin story of Israel's most ambivalent neighbors, the Moabites and the Ammonites. While the story elicits laughter, Lot's status as an outsider is crucial here, as the reader wouldn't have been comfortable with such a depiction of Abraham, for example, as a victim of sexual abuse. Thus, Lot's decrowning is the final straw that completely eliminates Lot as a potential heir for the covenant. In fact, it completely eliminates him from the narrative altogether. However, Lot, and consequently the Moabites and the Ammonites, are not completely severed from the Abraham and his line. True to the ambivalence of the genre, Genesis 19 contains no absolute negation or absolute affirmation of Lot and his descendants. Much like the genre, this reading itself is ambivalent. It isn't entirely satisfying. It confronts both Lot's callous disregard for his daughter's safety and the sexual abuse that Lot experiences, but none of the characters emerge as the hero of the story. But that's because there is no hero in Carnival, as the crown of the Carnival King is only temporary. There is no need to make excuses for Lot's actions or the actions of his two daughters because their actions are inexcusable. They elicit both laughter and horror. Thank you.